The debt collector found Arthur Vance sitting in a velvet chair, holding a cracked teacup, speaking to an empty room. When Miller pulled out the folder from behind the books, he discovered not property deeds, but hundreds of unopened letters addressed to a dead woman. And when he found the death certificate, Arthur's hands began to fade into dust. And Miller understood that he had broken into a haunted space that had been preserving itself for 3 years. Or perhaps much longer. 13 hours earlier, the London evening had descended wet and gray. Rain traced silver lines down the apartment windows, and Arthur sat motionless in his high-backed navy velvet armchair, his spine bent as if age had been slowly compressing him over decades. The armchair faced another chair, the one where Clara used to sit on Sunday mornings when she read the newspaper aloud to him, punctuating the stories with small, delighted laughs. That chair remained empty now, but Arthur kept it unoccupied, with the careful attention of a man protecting a shrine. The cushions had begun to flatten from disuse, but he never sat on them. That would have been a kind of betrayal. His right hand curved around a cracked white teacup. The china was old, the kind with a hairline fracture that had appeared sometime in the 1990s. He'd never replaced it, though Clara had suggested it more than once. Now he wouldn't have dreamed of discarding it. The cup held the shape of his palm the way a leather shoe holds the shape of a foot. His left hand rested on the armrest of the empty chair opposite him. Every evening at this hour, he would place it there. The gesture had become a ritual so automatic that his hand moved to the chair without his conscious instruction. Muscle memory of a devotion that refused to end. On the table before him sat a silver-framed portrait. The woman in the photograph had red hair, the kind of copper bright that seemed to hold its own light even in the flat gray of old photography. Her smile was genuine, not posed. The sort of smile that suggested she had just heard a joke she hadn't quite understood but found funny anyway. Clara. She wore a cream-colored dress and held a bouquet of roses. Arthur's thumb traced the glass over her face in slow, repetitive circles. His eyes had the glazed quality of someone looking through objects rather than at them. Dust motes danced in the yellow glow of the single-floor lamp, the only light he kept on in the evenings. The rest of the apartment remained in shadow, a cave of brown furniture and dimmed memories. The grandfather clock in the corner marked the seconds with its heavy tock-tock, tock-tock, a sound that had become the heartbeat of the flat. Outside, rain drummed against the window panes with increasing aggression. The weather report had predicted storms, but Arthur hadn't been listening. He rarely paid attention to weather anymore. Whether it rained or shone seemed irrelevant to the unchanging interior of his home. He leaned forward, and his voice emerged thin and rasping, like wind through dry reeds. "The hydrangeas are dying, Clara. I forgot to water them again." He said this as if she might respond, as if her silence was merely a temporary state, a pause in a conversation that could be resumed at any moment. His wedding ring, loose on his finger, slipped forward as he raised his hand from the armrest to gesture toward the window. The gold caught the lamplight, a brief flash of reflection against the gathering dark. Behind the armchair, through the open doorway to the study, more frames crowded the shelves. Photographs of holidays, a certificate of marriage dated 1985, ticket stubs from concerts they had attended together, a pressed flower from their honeymoon in Cornwall, sealed in a small glass case. Every object in the apartment had been arranged with the precision of a museum curator, each item chosen because it contained a piece of their shared history. The apartment itself was a mausoleum of togetherness. Arthur had not left it in 3 years, or perhaps it was longer. Time had become slippery here, a concept that lost meaning when every day unfolded identically. He had food delivered. The necessary bills were paid by automatic transfer. He had built a life in which external reality could not intrude upon the interior landscape of his grief. The rain intensified, and Arthur's head tilted toward the sound. For a moment, his eyes focused on the window, tracking the water as it streaked the glass. Then his gaze drifted back to the photograph. "I'll water them tomorrow," he whispered. But they both knew he wouldn't. Then came the sound. A sound so alien to the evening's composition of rain and clock ticks that it took him a moment to recognize it as a human action. A fist striking wood. Hard. Demanding. Bam, bam, bam. Arthur's entire body jerked as if electric current had passed through him. The teacup tumbled from his fingers. It fell through the air in slow motion, and he watched it with the detached horror of a man watching an inevitable disaster unfold. The porcelain shattered against the parquet floor, the impact sending cold tea spreading across the ancient wood like an accusation. The liquid soaked into the grain of the Persian rug beneath the table, and the stain seemed to mock him, a fresh violation of the careful preservation he'd maintained for so long. Bam, bam, bam. Again. More aggressive. Arthur's breathing quickened. His hands began to tremble. Visitors did not come to his apartment. No one came anymore. People had stopped coming years ago. He rose from the chair on unsteady legs, his cardigan, beige with a loose thread that had begun unraveling near the hem, shifting awkwardly around him. His movements were stiff, the movements of a body that had spent too long in stationary positions. He walked to the hallway, his footsteps echoing on the wood with unusual loudness. The apartment's silence had amplified over the years, so that now any sound seemed to disturb an atmosphere that had settled into something almost sacred. The front door stood before him, and he approached it as one might approach a trap. Through the brass peephole, he saw the distorted image of a man's face. The fisheye lens magnified the man's features into something almost monstrous. A nose too large, eyes too wide. He wore a black windbreaker, and stitched across the chest in white thread was a logo. Metro Recovery. The man held a yellow clipboard and, impossibly, a crowbar. Behind him, Arthur could hear muffled shouting. "Open up, Mr. Vance. We know you're in there." Arthur's face went pale. The sweat that beaded on his forehead felt cold, wrong. His hand reached toward the door lock, but did not turn it. "This is the final notice, Vance. The bank owns this furniture now." The voice cracked with the kind of aggression that came from a script read 100 times, each recitation less empathetic than the last. Arthur's heels clicked on the parquet as he backed away from the door. He retreated into the living room, his eyes moving across the furniture as if seeing it for the first time. The armchair, the side tables, the display case of porcelain thimbles, the bookshelf holding leather-bound volumes that had belonged to Clara's mother. All of it would be taken. That's what he understood in this moment. The collection he had preserved, the objects that held the shape of his past, they were not his. They belonged to a bank, a creditor, someone whose name he did not know and whose claims superseded his own. The pounding at the door continued, rhythmic and relentless. Then came the sound of splintering wood. The front door burst inward, the frame cracking like a gunshot. The man, Miller, though Arthur did not yet know his name, stepped through the threshold, his black boots dripping rain onto the floor. His shoulders were broad, his face set in a professional grimace. Arthur found himself standing in the living room doorway, his arms spread wide as if his body could somehow block the physical intrusion of this man into his space. "You can't take these." Arthur's voice cracked as it rose. "This is all that's left of her." Miller moved past Arthur's shoulder without breaking stride. his windbreaker brushing against the older man's body. Arthur grabbed for Miller's arm, his fingers closing around the fabric. But the collector shook him off with a violence that was almost casual. Miller reached for the silver-framed portrait of Clara on the side table, his gloved hand closing around the frame. Arthur lunged. It was not a calculated move. It was pure instinct, the animal desperation of a creature facing extinction. He wrapped his arms around Miller's waist and drove forward, using his body as a weapon. They crashed to the floor together, falling onto the Persian rug in a tangle of limbs. Arthur's hands scrabbled for the portrait, his fingers clawing at Miller's jacket. His breathing came in ragged gasps. He was stronger than he looked, drawing on reserves of adrenaline that desperation alone could provide. Miller pivoted beneath him and drove his elbow backward. The impact struck Arthur's ribs with enough force to knock the air from his lungs. A bright spike of pain shot through his chest, and Arthur gasped, his grip loosening for just a moment. That was enough. Miller rolled to the side, then over, pinning Arthur down with one knee planted firmly on his chest. The weight pressed down like a stone, and Arthur found himself unable to draw a full breath. Miller held the portrait high, his face twisted in a sneer. And then, with a gesture of deliberate contempt, he tossed it onto the navy velvet armchair. Arthur lay on the floor, his ribs screaming, his eyes following the portrait as it landed on the cushion where Clara had never sat, but where Arthur had kept one hand in an endless vigil. Miller stood, breathing hard. His chest rose and fell beneath the black windbreaker. "I'm not here for the trinkets, old man," he said, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone who had delivered this line so many times it had lost all meaning. "I'm here for the deed. Where's the safe?" Arthur made no move to comply. He lay on the Persian rug, breathing through the pain, his eyes fixed on the portrait. A small bead of blood formed at the corner of his mouth, but he seemed not to notice it. Miller grabbed him by the collar and hauled him up. They moved through the apartment like a grotesque dance, Arthur limping, Miller propelling him forward through doorways and down hallways. When they reached the study, Arthur moved toward the bookshelf as if performing a duty, his body operating independently of his will. He pulled back a row of leather-bound books, revealing a small gray digital safe recessed into the wall. His fingers, which trembled with something beyond fear, moved to the keypad. The metal was cold beneath his skin. His fingers punched in the code. 1014. October 14th. Clara's birthday. Though Clara was no longer alive, her birthday remained a door through which Arthur could unlock the most private chambers of his grief. Beep, 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 beep. Electronic sounds marked each digit as it registered. The mechanical click that followed seemed to take an eternity. The green light flickered on. Miller pushed Arthur aside and reached into the safe's dark interior. His hand emerged with a thick blue folder, and for a moment, his face showed something like satisfaction. Finally, the deed. The paperwork he needed to execute the removal of assets. He opened the folder. His expression changed. Inside were not property deeds. Instead, the folder contained hundreds of unopened letters. They overflowed from the blue cardboard, envelopes pressing against the folder's walls as if desperate to escape. Each envelope was addressed in careful, deliberate handwriting to Clara Vance, from a name written in the upper left corner. Julian. Miller flipped through them, watching postmarks cascade backward through time. 2023, 2020, 2015, 2010. They stretched back more than a decade, an archive of communication sent to a woman, with each envelope remaining sealed, each one collecting dust in the darkness of a safe. Arthur stood with his hands covering his face. Miller dug deeper into the folder. Beneath the letters lay a single sheet of paper. He pulled it out carefully, as if handling something that might contaminate him through contact alone. It was a death certificate, the kind issued by the government, official and stamped and final. His eyes scanned the name. Arthur Vance. Below that, the date. March 14th, 2020. Miller looked up from the certificate. He looked at Arthur, who stood with his hands still pressed against his face. Then he looked down at his own hands, at the paper they held, at the official seal that authenticated the words printed upon it. He dropped the certificate. It fluttered to the floor like a dead thing. "What the hell are you?" Miller whispered. Arthur's hands fell from his face. He picked up the blue folder, handling it with care, and he looked toward the living room, where a shadow had begun to form on the wall. The shadow of a woman, dark and clear against the cream-colored paint. A soft laughter echoed through the apartment, distant and echoing, as if traveling through vast distances to reach them. Miller's boots scuffed the floor as he retreated backward, his eyes wide, his professional composure shattered by something that transcended the simple mechanics of debt collection. Arthur stood silently, the blue folder held against his chest. The laughter continued, growing neither closer nor more distant, but simply present, an atmosphere rather than a sound, a presence that saturated the space between walls. Miller recovered first, his fear transmuting into something more dangerous, aggressive denial. He pulled a heavy-duty Maglite flashlight from his belt and gripped it like a club. The rationalization was simple. Flashlights were solid objects that existed in the material world. If something was material, it could be hit. If it could be hit, it could be stopped. He swung the flashlight through the air where Arthur stood, the beam cutting a wild arc through the shadow of the laughter. The device passed through the edge of Arthur's shoulder and clipped against his solid cardigan with a heavy thud. Arthur made no move to dodge. His hand shot out with a speed that seemed impossible for a man of his apparent age, closing around Miller's wrist with a grip like ice-cold iron. Despite his spectral nature, his physical strength was undeniable. The strength of something that no longer operated under the normal constraints of human biology. Arthur twisted Miller's arm behind his back, bending the collector's wrist with methodical precision. Miller's wrist bones popped, an audible sound like twigs snapping. A cry of pain escaped him, a sound of pure anguish that echoed off the apartment's walls and seemed to disturb the air itself. But Miller was trained in survival. He slammed his back against Arthur, driving his shoulders backward with desperate force. The impact crushed Arthur against the study wall, and the plaster cracked behind him. Miller spun and threw a punch directly at Arthur's face. His fist connected, and the impact felt like striking concrete. Arthur's head snapped back, but no blood emerged from his lips. Only a faint puff of gray dust, like ash from a cigarette gently tapped over an ashtray. Gray dust that swirled in the flashlight's beam, a visible manifestation of whatever Arthur had become. Arthur pushed Miller back with a surge of strength that came from somewhere beyond muscle and bone. Miller stumbled backward, his boots catching the edge of the Persian rug, and he crashed into a small glass display case containing a collection of porcelain thimbles. The case exploded, glass shards scattering across the floor like diamonds, the thimbles bouncing away in all directions. Miller lay amid the shards, gasping for air, his hands cut and bleeding. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain and the blood, driven by something deeper than professional obligation. He spotted the brass fire extinguisher mounted on the wall beside the radiator, and he grabbed it. Pulling it from its moorings, he hefted it like a club, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild. "Living or dead," he roared, "I'm clearing this place out." He swung the extinguisher at Arthur in a movement fueled by the desperate violence of a cornered animal. Arthur sidestepped the swing, moving with the precision of someone no longer bound by the constraints of a body that needed to obey the laws of physics. The extinguisher passed through the space where he had been, the air distorting slightly around it. "The furniture," Arthur said quietly. "Please, don't take any more." But Miller was beyond hearing. He dragged a heavy oak chair from the dining room toward the door, pulling it across the parquet with a sound like screeching metal. As the chair moved, Arthur's form became noticeably more translucent, his edges bleeding into the surrounding air like watercolor left in the rain. He gripped the edge of the kitchen table, his fingers sinking into the formica surface, and his body flickered, solidifying, fading, solidifying again. The process like a film reel with missing frames. Miller kicked the kitchen door open and began hauling armfuls of items. Vintage plates from the counter, glasses from the cabinet, anything that could be moved. He hurled them into a large industrial plastic bin he had brought up from the truck below. Smash. Crack. The sound of porcelain breaking, and with each impact, Arthur's body seemed to fracture in sympathy, his form becoming more insubstantial. Arthur clutched his stomach, doubling over as a plate broke. Every object destroyed seemed to hurt him with physical intensity, a sympathetic connection between his existence and the material world that surrounded him. On the kitchen wall, a digital clock displayed the time. 11:45 p.m. A red LED light blinked steadily. Low battery, low battery. The chirp it made was sharp and insistent, a sound like a bird caught in walls. Arthur reached for a small handwritten recipe card taped to the refrigerator. Clara's Sunday roast, written in fading blue ink above a list of ingredients he knew by heart. Ingredients he had watched her use dozens of times, standing beside her in the kitchen while she moved between stove and counter, with the grace of someone performing a beloved ritual. He tried to peel the card from the door, but his fingers passed through it. He could no longer touch the things he loved. His hand ghosted through the paper, and the reality of this disconnection, the fact that the material world was now beyond his reach, struck him with more force than any blow Miller could deliver. Profound sadness replaced the fear. His eyes filled with spectral tears that seemed to be made of something thinner than water. Miller returned for the kitchen table. He produced a power drill from his tool belt and positioned the bit against one of the table legs. He squeezed the trigger. Zisht, zisht, zisht. The sound of the drill bit biting into wood, the high-pitched whine reverberating through the apartment. The vibration alone seemed to cause Arthur agony. He tried to scream, but no sound emerged. His jaw opened unnaturally, unhinged, and he looked for a moment like something that had never been human. A creature that had been wearing the shape of humanity the way one wears a suit. Then the moment passed, and Arthur collapsed into a chair, his form now barely visible, translucent to the point of transparency. Miller's footsteps echoed as he dragged the table toward the door. The progress continued, methodical and relentless, the slow deconstruction of the apartment's interior. It was during one of these trips that the new visitor arrived. She walked through the broken front door with the casual confidence of ownership, stepping over the debris and broken furniture with an expression of disgust. She was in her late 20s, wearing a sharp gray business suit and designer heels that clicked against the floor with each step. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her face, young and hard and beautiful, bore an unmistakable resemblance to the woman in the portrait. Clara. But this woman had Clara's features rearranged by a different temperament, as if the same genetic material had been reassembled by someone with a colder vision of what beauty could be. Miller stopped his work and looked at her, sweat beading on his brow. He glanced toward the corner where Arthur was crouching, nearly invisible against the shadows. "Miss Vance?" Miller said, his voice uncertain. There's something wrong with this place. I think we should leave the rest for tomorrow. Sarah Vance looked at him with open disdain. She walked to the velvet chair and picked up the portrait. She held it for a second, her expression unchanged, and then she turned it around in her hands and looked at her own mother's face. A woman she had never known except through photographs and stories told by a man who loved her too much to speak about her death. She threw the portrait face down on the floor. The glass shattered. The sound was sharp and clean, a punctuation mark to something final. The photograph of Clara lay among the shards, a face surrounded by fragments of mirror that reflected fractured light. My father spent 20 years haunting this mausoleum, Sarah said, her voice sharp and icy. He's dead, Miller. This is just garbage and bad memories. Arthur tried to stand. He reached out for Sarah's arm, his hand passing through her like smoke and shadow. But something about the gesture, some disturbance in the air itself, made Sarah pause. She rubbed her arm where Arthur's touch had passed through her, suddenly cold. For just a moment, she heard a voice. Her own name, whispered in a tone of grief and longing so profound that it contained entire lifetimes within its single syllable. Sarah. Then it was gone. Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a legal document titled Notice of Eviction and Sale. She walked to the center of the living room and taped it to the wall, the document covering the space where a family photograph used to hang. I'm selling the unit to a developer, she said, addressing Miller as one addresses a servant. They're gutting it on Monday. Move faster. She turned and walked back out of the apartment, her heels clicking against the floor in a steady, determined rhythm that suggested a person who did not look back. Miller watched her go, then looked at the empty space where Arthur had been. The corner was empty now, but it seemed to hold a kind of presence anyway. The atmosphere of something that had been there, the way a room retains the warmth of someone long after they've left it. He returned to his work, moving faster now, driven by an urgency he couldn't quite articulate. There was something about this apartment that had begun to feel like a living thing, something that was trying to tell him to leave. But he was a professional. He had debts to collect, furniture to seize, rooms to empty. He would finish the job. He had to finish the job. Arthur, meantime, had begun to concentrate in a way he hadn't in years. Every ounce of will, every fragment of consciousness that remained to him, he gathered and focused on a single point. The electricity in the walls, the ancient wiring that Clara had always complained about, the way lights would flicker during storms. He drew upon it. The lights in the apartment exploded. Glass shards rained down like a meteor shower, fragments of bulbs and fixtures falling in all directions. The darkness that followed was total. A darkness that seemed to have weight and substance. A darkness that pressed against the skin like cold water. When Arthur manifested, he did so in a form that was no longer entirely human. His eyes glowed white, bright as exposed bone, and his body held a solidity it had lacked moments before. He looked like a photograph overexposed, a figure too bright to see clearly, edges bleeding into the surrounding shadows. He grabbed the brass fire extinguisher, the one Miller had been wielding moments earlier, and hurled it with a violence born from grief and desperation. The cylinder of metal flew through the air and struck Miller directly, the impact throwing him backward against the wall. The extinguisher fell to the floor with a heavy ring that echoed through the apartment. Miller rolled across the floor, gasping, and pulled out a pocket knife. He began slashing at the air, the blade seeking Arthur's form with desperate sweeps. The knife passed through Arthur's body in places, creating ripples in the air, distortions in reality where the blade encountered something that refused to be fully physical. Other slashes connected with more solid forms of Arthur's manifestation. The blade hissed when it struck, sparks flying where the knife met metal. The radiator, a light fixture, anything in the path of Miller's panic-driven violence. Arthur turned toward Sarah, who had taken shelter behind an overturned sofa, watching the confrontation with wide eyes. He moved toward her with a speed that transcended normal movement, covering the distance between them in a way that seemed to involve traveling through rather than across the space. He grabbed her by the throat. Unlike with Miller, whose body was partially transparent to spiritual violence, Sarah was held fast. Arthur lifted her inches off the ground, her feet kicking frantically, her breath cutting off. Her briefcase fell, spilling papers everywhere. Legal documents, contracts, the machinery of her claim to the apartment, and everything it contained. Miller rushed forward and tackled Arthur's torso. The impact felt like hitting a wall of ice, a barrier of cold so intense it burned the skin on contact. They crashed through the glass coffee table together, the surface exploding into fragments that cut Miller's arms and face, drawing blood that was real and physical and utterly inconsistent with the spectral nature of what he was fighting. Arthur stood, unharmed by the impact. He picked up a large, jagged piece of glass, its edge like a dagger, and turned to face Miller, who was crawling backward, leaving a trail of blood on the parquet floor. But as he moved, something shifted in the apartment itself. The walls began to peel back, not revealing brick or foundation, but something else entirely. A void of white light that seemed to contain infinite distance. The wallpaper curled away like burning paper, and the furniture that Miller hadn't yet moved began to turn into gray ash that drifted upward, caught on a wind that had no source. Arthur stopped moving. He looked at the peeling walls with the expression of someone recognizing their own doom. Sarah grabbed Miller. They looked toward the front door, but the door was gone. In its place was a solid wall of the same white light that was consuming the apartment structure. There was no exit. Sarah pounded on the light, her hands disappearing for moments as they touched the strange radiance, her voice cracking as she screamed for help. But the building around them seemed deaf to her cries. A low-frequency hum began to emanate from within the walls, a sound that made teeth rattle and bones vibrate. The air grew thin, as if oxygen itself was being drawn out of the space. Arthur patted his cardigan and found something in the pocket. A photograph, the paper worn soft with age. He looked at it with eyes that had become something other than human eyes. It was a photograph of himself as a young man, holding a baby. He wore the same beige cardigan, impossibly. His face was unlined, his hair still dark. But the essential quality of his features, the structure of his skull, the arch of his brows, was unchanged. The baby in his arms was sleeping, wrapped in a white blanket. Her face was barely visible, just the curve of a cheek and the soft brown of closed eyes. He looked at the back of the photograph. Written in his own younger handwriting, Sarah's first birthday. I will never leave her. The realization struck him with a force more devastating than any physical blow. He had never left her. He had died 3 years ago, March 14th, 2020, the certificate had said. But he had never left. A figure emerged from the darkness above him. It looked like Clara. But it wasn't. It was something that had been wearing Clara's shape the way a hermit crab wears a shell. The mouth was sewn shut with black thread, pulled so tight that the lips had split at the corners. Where eyes should have been were only empty sockets, darkness within darkness. The figure wore a red dress that had once been beautiful, but was now tattered, the fabric hanging like diseased skin. Arthur wept as he looked at it. The Clara-entity pointed upward, where Sarah was visible through a window. A circular aperture in the void, through which her aged form could be seen, trapped in the dissolving apartment, aging toward invisibility. The entity's movements were demands without sound. Stay. Keep us here. Preserve the love. The gesture was insistent, commanding, the motion of something that had grown accustomed to being obeyed. Arthur looked at his own hands. They were turning into gray ash. The particles crumbled away from the tips of his fingers, drifting downward in a slow dispersal that suggested time itself was decomposing within this space. If he stayed, he understood. Sarah would follow. She would age into nothing, become a ghost before she even died, trap herself in the same mausoleum that had claimed him. The entity lunged at him. It moved with a speed that should have been impossible, its thin, spindly arms wrapping around him like the legs of an insect. The contact was ice, a cold so profound it seemed to burn. Arthur struggled, but he was already fading. The strength that had manifested moments earlier was draining away, absorbed into the void itself. He looked up at Sarah one final time. She was barely visible now, a shadow aging into transparency, the last light leaving her eyes. Arthur found something in his pocket, the pen he had used to sign his own death certificate, the ballpoint that had made the name Arthur Vance official, permanent, irrevocable. He gripped it with what remained of his physical strength and drove it into the Clara-entity's hand. The entity shrieked. It was not a human sound. It was the sound of metal on glass, multiplied 1,000-fold, a frequency that seemed to split the space itself. Black fluid leaked from the wound, not blood, but something darker, something that looked like absence, given substance. The grip loosened. Arthur climbed. He climbed upward through the abyss, pushing past the falling objects, pushing toward the window where Sarah's aged form had begun to fade entirely. He reached the blue folder that Miller had dropped. His hands passed through the paper for a moment before solidifying enough to grip it. He pulled the death certificate free. It was still damp from when Miller had sweated upon it. Arthur carried it toward Sarah. As her hands touched the document, her appearance reverted. The white hair faded back to blonde. The wrinkles smoothed. Her aged skin returned to its proper firmness. Color flooded back into her face. She gasped, suddenly able to breathe normally again, her lungs drawing in air as if returning from underwater. Arthur turned toward the broken front door, which had reappeared. The hallway beyond was now visible, filled with the clear, golden light of dawn. He didn't look back at the room. He looked only at the light of the hallway, at the promise of exit, at the possibility of finally, after years of clinging and holding and refusing to release, letting go. He removed his wedding ring. It came free from his finger with surprising ease, as if his hand had been preparing for this moment since March 14th, 2020. He watched it fall, turning in the air, catching fragments of disappearing light. The ring hit the parquet floor with a small but distinct sound. Ting. It rolled for a moment, spinning on its edge, before settling into stillness on the wooden grain. Arthur dissolved. He became white petals, thousands of them, drifting upward like snow falling in reverse. Each petal was translucent, barely visible, catching light the way silk catches light. The storm outside the apartment stopped in the same instant. The rain ceased. The wind died. A single bird landed on the windowsill and chirped, one clear, bright note that seemed to pierce the heavy silence that had settled over the space. Sarah sat against the wall, the death certificate in her hands, looking at the date of her father's death. She looked at Miller, who was bandaging his arm with strips of gauze, his movements slow and careful, as if he was still coming to terms with the fact that he had survived something that should have been impossible. The apartment was empty. Not aesthetically empty, but genuinely empty. The way a building becomes empty after a presence has finally departed. They sat in silence as the morning light grew stronger through the windows. The sun rose over London, and the rain stopped completely. The clouds began to break apart, revealing patches of blue sky. The weather report that had predicted storms and gray for weeks to come had been wrong. The storm was over. Sarah stood and walked to the window. The city below was waking up, traffic beginning to move on the streets, people beginning their days with the ordinary assumption that the world continued according to rational laws. She looked back at her father's wedding ring, sitting alone on the parquet floor where it had fallen. She did not pick it up. She walked instead to the front door, the door that no longer splintered, the door that hung open on its hinges, revealing the normal hallway with its normal walls and normal carpet. She walked through it. Miller followed her, moving slowly, still processing what he had witnessed. Behind them, the apartment fell.